Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to our Paddle and Appcues retention webinar. Hi from sunny London. I can see you're all connecting over here, so we're just gonna give you a little bit more time to connect. Very excited to have you all today. I'm Bianca. I'm the events manager here at Paddle. We at Paddle offer an all-in-one commerce platform for SaaS. We handle checkout, payments, invoicing, tax, billing, and more for software companies. So you can focus on growing your business without getting held back by tooling and infrastructure. We recently published a guide on our top 5 churn reduction strategies. So you're interested in checking that out, go to our website. You can see it over there. Let us know how your March and April have been trending. We want to keep the conversation going. We're super interested in how you've been doing during these crazy times. We'd also like to thank our partner, Appcues, for participating in the webinar today. If you're not already familiar with Appcues, they help SaaS businesses increase product adoption and retention with code-free product tours, guides, alerts, and surveys. We here at Paddle, we've been using and loving Appcues here, so we recommend giving them a try. Just go to appcues.com. Today, we're joined by our expert speakers, Eric Keating, VP of Marketing at Appcues, who's tuning in from Boston, and Paddle's Chief Customer Officer, Harrison Rose, who's calling in from New York. And thanks to Eric for joining us today. Would you like to introduce yourself to our audience over here?
Harrison, you want to go first?
Yeah, hey everyone. Yeah, I'm Harrison, co-founder and Chief Customer Officer at Paddle. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. Really excited to be talking to you all about retention and churn today, and really excited to be running you through it with Eric.
Yeah, same. So yeah, like Bianca said, I head up marketing at Appcues. I've been in SaaS for all of my career, so plenty of experience with churn and retention, and obviously working with our customers on those strategies as well. And just hope everybody is feeling physically and mentally well. Appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
So Eric, little birdie tells us you like to brew beer at home. That sounds like the perfect lockdown hobby for us. Would you care to give Harrison some tips? Because he actually tried to give us biscuit flavored beer at Paddle before. So can you tell him biscuit flavor is not a thing?
It is a thing. It is a thing. Yeah, there's actually a malt called biscuit malt. So Harrison, respect. Maybe you just need some practice. I don't know. But yeah, I got a 2- and a 4-year-old running around, so not a lot of time to brew beer right now, unfortunately.
Turns out I'm much better at drinking beer than brewing it, it seems.
I tried the biscuit beer. I don't know. I think it was because we were in the biscuit factory at the time, so it was a good pun, but less great beer, I guess. So cool. So we're gonna kick off very soon with some practical advice on voluntary and involuntary churn. We're gonna leave plenty of time at the end for questions. We actually received dozens of questions from you guys during registrations. So we're gonna make sure we leave enough time. This is an AMA, so we're gonna cover that at the end thoroughly. So please ask your questions in the Q&A button, and you can upvote other questions as well. So if your question is similar, just upvote the one for more visibility. Just for housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand as soon as possible after we finish up here. So you can share the webinar with your colleagues and your friends. We also follow up with an email asking you to fill in a survey. We'd really appreciate it if you do this. It's really awesome feedback for us to make sure that we do the next one even better. So with that being said, I would like to hand over to Harrison, who is our in-house churn expert. Harrison?
Hopefully you can all see everything okay. Yeah, I think a great starting point would just be kind of taking a temperature of where things are at for everyone on the call. Eric and I would love to hear in the comments section, how the past few months been? Are you still managing to acquire customers and expand into some existing accounts? Or on the other hand, have you started to see a rise in cancellations, perhaps folks pausing their subscriptions? Would love to hear kind of what you've been seeing in the comments just to kick us off and really understand where everyone's at. As Bianca said, she'll be taking and keeping a close eye on the Q&A and the comment sections, and we'll do our best throughout this to answer questions that are submitted as we go through, call out any great experiences or comments that are all flying through. I guess that from my perspective, to kick things off, the general consensus is that a lot of the conversation at board level or C-level has shifted in this kind of COVID-19 era to ensure that we keep hold of the customers we've already worked so hard to acquire. And that's exactly what we're talking about today in terms of retention. But before we dive in, Eric, anything you want to add before we jump in and start looking at the market, some of the data, and answering some of these questions?
No, except I think, when we're looking at all this data, I think there's some of it that's broken down by different business types. Some of it is kind of aggregate data. So it's important to keep that in mind. Because, we're seeing certain industries do really well, very small amount of them, but we're also seeing pretty big differences in behavior across e-commerce and B2B SaaS, for example. So just good context to have for some of the data we look at.
Absolutely. Almost the answer to every question becomes like, well, it depends on who you're targeting and where your business is at, right? So bear with us, but I couldn't agree more. Okay, so let's get a little bit of a lay of the land before we dive into the strategies and kind of answering some of your questions. And we wanted to look at some kind of external sources to gauge how things were going for SaaS businesses out there. And to start with, we looked at data by the Revenue Collective, an organization I'm super proud to be a member of, and their findings show just how tough it is for acquisition out there. They say 96% of revenue leaders have been impacted by COVID-19, and the vast majority have had to reduce targets between kind of 25 to 50%, and only a handful has seen a benefit and had been able to increase their forecast to kind of Zooms and Slacks of this world, perhaps. So this is a really tough time to be acquiring new customers or even expanding within the customers you already have. I'd love to hear how some of these statements and these stats are resonating with the audience and hear some of your views. And please keep throwing bits in the comments. I'll let that build up for a little bit before we start calling out some of your experiences. So that's kind of the state of things on the acquisition side. But what about retention? How is that faring? We work with some friends at ProfitWell to really gauge this and understand it. And they produce the subscriptions index, which graphs how the MRR flowing through their platform is performing. And ultimately what they found was March 2020 was one of the biggest months of churn in SaaS history. And the index kind of shows, as you can see here, the ProfitWell install base kind of moving into a decline in mid-March, and we're yet to see a kind of a rebound there. So this starts to give you a picture of kind of what we've been seeing in the market. And Eric, I think you're keen to share what you've been looking at with HubSpot and Intellimise.
Yeah. So just to be clear up front, this isn't, while we do use HubSpot, this isn't our data, like internally. This is data that HubSpot shared, aggregate data across all of their customers. I think so we're looking at 4 different graphs here. First one, we're looking at deals created and deals closed, and this is compared to a pre-COVID benchmark, right? So it's like they're down compared to the benchmark. And what the first graph is showing us is that deal creation is down, close rates are down, right? Not totally surprising. What's interesting is that the chart right below that, we're seeing that website traffic overall is up across the board, right, on average. We're also seeing that marketing emails, we're sending more marketing emails and the open rates are even up. Now, in contrast, on the sales side, sales emails, BDR, SDR emails, and response rates, we're sending more of them, but response rates are down. Again, not surprising. So I think the really interesting takeaway here is, though, even though there's seemingly more top of funnel interest, I think, based on what I've seen, it's really that people are spending more time online, they're consuming more content, they may even be kicking the tires on more products. But ultimately, again, going back to that chart on the top left, they're not turning into real sales conversations, and they're certainly not closing like they were before.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I even thinking about our own experience at Paddle, we've certainly seen some of this personally. Like our response rates are down on our BDR outreach. Interestingly, we've seen a lift in phone call connections and trying to break through that mold to some extent. And I think you want to talk about what you drew out of the Intellimise data next, right?
Yeah. So just to go, kind of go back to that, more web traffic, fewer deals. Web conversion rates are down across the board, right? So again, not surprising. But I think one of the biggest drivers of this is, there are a lot more marketing campaigns happening, more digital events, thematically, a lot more content being produced right now. So, you're going to have a lot more folks that are just kind of trying to educate themselves or level up their skills during this time. Again, a lot more people spending time online. But when you break that down by industry, you do see actually that B2B as a whole and B2B SaaS was actually up in the second half of March. Again, this data takes into consideration any kind of form conversion, so content subscriptions, trial starts. Coming back to, there's a lot, we're seeing personally a lot more tire kickers, right? When I say that, I don't know if that's a term that's widely understood, but somebody who's just kind of coming in to check things out. They've got more time, they're evaluating more software, but they're not serious about making any kind of purchase right now. And even in the first half of April, we saw those both drop down quite a bit. So I think the long story short is, while there are a lot of folks seeing increased web traffic and maybe even increased trialers, we're not seeing them turn into business like they were pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm. The take looking at this data for me was, it was just interesting to see that those lifts, yeah, in kind of B2C SaaS and so on and so forth. And at Paddle, given that we process kind of 100 millions in ARR annually through the platform, we're in a quite unique position to try and look at this ourselves. And we too have definitely seen a lift on the B2C SaaS side of things. I think one of the most interesting takeaways for us, and this links to your very early point, Eric, that you need to start to break some of this stuff out, is that we saw regions locked down actually see an increase in performance. Italy, one of the kind of most extreme lockdowns that happened quite early in this journey, we saw sales up 38% in the region during the lockdown period, and B2C was the real contributing factor there. And it shows you really that you need to start looking at this by segment. We tried to look into that in particular a little bit more by looking at B2B versus B2C ourselves. Because it was our assumption that those selling kind of high value B2B products were going to be those that are most impacted. And we threw together this kind of B2B SaaS buyers index, we call it, that you can see in front of you. And really simply what this is we looked at the number of wire transfers going through the Paddle systems. Typically these wire transfers are super high value payments, sometimes in the hundreds of thousands of dollars that are getting paid over wire rather than card. And on the whole, these are the B2B transactions. But here, to articulate how you can see differences in B2C versus B2B, the volumes of these types of transactions drop down to kind of Christmas levels, when I'm sure a lot of folks listening can appreciate not a lot of high value B2B SaaS deals are done. Metrics are down kind of 75%, and we're starting to see those recover. But like with the Intellimise data, we really need to see how this plays out. Again, any comment, Bianca, from the audience or anything to clarify or to hear about their experiences before we start to think about some strategies and answering some of the questions that these folks have?
Yeah, definitely. So Brian is mentioning that revenue is up, but also churn, and that the increase in revenue is outpacing churn.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Yeah, I think everyone's going to be in a unique position, right? Even hearing some of this stuff, you can't help but have your mind race and want to know what they're selling. Have they had to evolve their messaging in COVID in order to acquire more of those customers? And why is retention up too? Are they the same customers you're acquiring? What's going on there? I don't know if you've had any thoughts, Eric, or seen anything in terms of how people have tried to accelerate acquisition during this period and evolve messaging, perhaps to not take advantage, it's probably the wrong words, but to try and do the best they can during this tough time.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And on the messaging front, this is one of the questions I think we got in the registration, but mm-hmm. there are certain topics that are more interesting right now because of the circumstances we're all in. One, certainly retention, right? We're seeing a lot of content come out about retention right now. But the other thing is doing more with less. So any kind of productivity or time savings. So, if your product does anything to help specifically with the circumstances that people are in today, I think it's the right time to try to emphasize that. And, if you want to, instead of going, all in on it, if you want to just run some tests and see how that messaging performs versus what your standard messaging is, people are thinking a lot more about, rather than like growth and optimism and big promises, they're thinking more about, okay, really practically, how can I increase my retention? How can I do more with less right now? I have fewer people around me, or I have a lot more responsibility now. So those are the themes that you should be thinking about. And then in terms of closing more business, I think it's just the constraint is cash, almost unanimously across the board, right? So cash flow, and as well as overall commitments. So if you offer annual commitments right now, I think it's the right time to use monthly payment terms at a minimum, if not monthly commitments as a lever. The other thing is deferred payments, right? So if it's an annual contract, you sign up now, first payment won't be due till 3 or 6 months from now. That's the constraint, right? People are having a very tough time going to their head of finance and saying, hey, I need to buy this new software right now. There's a lot of critical eyes being put on this stuff. So if you can say, well, we're not gonna have to pay for it for 6 months, or we're on a monthly commitment, so if we're not seeing the value in 3 months, we can back out. That's how we're thinking about it. That's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of those internal debates and tough internal discussions are happening, I think, in every company. And to jump back to the question, it sounds like that there's even a bit of not confusion, but a lack of clarity as to where you should be focusing. Should you be leaning in on that acquisition uplift that you're seeing, or should you be really worried about this retention problem? Where should I be focusing my efforts? What software should I be buying? Per Eric's point, what is the right thing to do in light of all of this data that's being thrown at me and all of these new scenarios? And that's a bit of the question we want to answer today. And to Eric's point, what can we actually all tactically do that's going to have a really big impact? And hopefully we can give you some answers or some suggestions on that stuff. I think that the reason we think about retention, or to get clarity on that question on whether you should be focusing on acquisition or retention, I'd really encourage the folks listening today to ask yourselves this. And it's a time when some are working with reduced budgets, as Eric has said, or reduced staff, or reduced tooling, whatever it may be. And we're seeing some of those challenging times in terms of acquisition per the revenue collected data and HubSpot data, or some of the tough times in retention per ProfitWell. What would you rather do? Should we look to increase acquisition 14% each month, as some of us may be able to do? Or to achieve the same outcome in terms of dollars, should we just look to reduce dollar churn of customers by kind of 1%? Because ultimately those two things could lead you to the same outcome, which is what we're trying to visualize here. Or you can look at this in a slightly different way, demonstrated to you. But ultimately, I think that the point that we recognize and have started to talk to a lot of sellers about is marginal improvements to kind of dollar churn or churn have a colossal impact on revenue. And Eric and I have a bunch of strategies that we're going to run you through to try and achieve these figures and these outcomes, and hopefully answer your questions about it along the way before that longer AMA at the end. But in my eyes and my personal view, hitting that churn reduction figure, dropping that 1% per this, it's something that is achievable for every SaaS company out there, and can be done quickly and efficiently if you prioritize some of the right things. And that's really what we want to dig into today. To lead into that or kick off, a quick refresher on just some basic concepts before we dive deep and think about questions and strategies. So I want you to think about two types of churn. Some of you may be familiar with this. So firstly, I want you to be aware of kind of voluntary churn. This is sometimes known as active churn. These are the customers actively choosing to cancel their subscriptions. They're hitting your account area and hitting that cancel button, or calling you up and requesting that they cancel their subscription. Secondly, the second type of churn is involuntary churn, sometimes known as delinquent churn or passive churn. These are the customers' subscriptions that are canceling due to failed payments. I'm sure you guys are familiar with these concepts, but I want to make sure we're all singing from the same hymn sheet before we dive deep into some of the strategies. And when we think about those, and when we think about retention, we really need to acknowledge when the churn is happening. Is this a pre-churn event before the subscription renewal is due, or is it a post-churn event? So after that subscription renewal is cancelled or has failed already. And this is really important because I know Eric is going to share some deep insight into how your approach to retention should vary based on customer lifecycle and where they're at in their journey, which is another take on this, and he's going to run you through that shortly. But again, just the final thing that I want us to run through to really frame the discussion today is to think about churn in terms of these four quadrants as well. And you can use this to broadly group your churn reduction strategies together and also spot the gaps where you're missing out or where you perhaps have underinvested. And to run through them very briefly, one way to prevent churn is obviously by keeping users happy and active. And Eric's going to talk a lot about how pre-churn we can retain more folks and engage them appropriately and lead them on great onboarding experiences, for example. Secondly, we've got cancellation offers. So when customers try to click cancel, find out why, and take them on a user experience or a user flow which makes offers to deflect their cancellation request. There's amazing content out there which sees figures of up to 15% of cancellations deflected, and more than happy to answer some questions and talk about that a little bit later. Next, we got payment acceptance. So this is stopping subscriptions from failing and that churn happening accidentally, and involuntary churn is stopping that happening in the first place. This is a kind of clear pre-churn prevention strategy. And lastly, there's work on payment recovery. This is how you recover failed payments after the fact. Now, it's our belief you should build a complete churn reduction strategy across all 4 of these quadrants to be most successful. And that way you'll maximize your chances to reduce churn and improve revenue retention. And today, we're going to zero in on some areas we think are going to be most impactful during this time. And I know Eric is definitely keen to take us through kind of Appcues' take on how we should group up retention strategies. But again, before we start diving into some of that content and some of this actionable advice, I'm not sure, again, if there's anything from the floor that is worthwhile us taking at this point, Bianca, before we dive into the details.
No questions yet, but feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A button.
As we run through, perfect.
Cool. So when you actually, could you just pop back to that slide for a second?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I go through the next 2 slides, really just one core concept. What we're really focused on are the top 2, mostly the top left, but a little bit of how you think about the strategy for the top right as well. So yeah, going on to the next slide. So just wanted to introduce this idea. We worked with a ton of SaaS business out there, customers of ours as well as not, from small scale startups all the way up to Fortune 500 companies, kind of figure out a way to visualize the user journey inside of your product and what stage they're at with your company. So just a little more detail about that on the next slide is, so we basically broke it down into, there are evaluators, beginners, regulars, and champions. And each one of these types of users are very different. They're at different stages of adoption with your product, and their mindset is very different. And so when you think about that top right, before I kind of lean into that top left box there, when you're thinking about re-engaging churn customers or introducing cancellation surveys or creating offers, compelling offers for people to come back, it's important to first understand where they were in their journey before you do that, because people who have only spent a couple of weeks in your product are going to respond to messaging and offers differently than those who used to be big advocates of your product before they churned. So I just wanted to make note of that. But when you think about these different groups, evaluators, so when you have a trial or a freemium product, this is a very clear segment. These are folks who just started using the product. They're probably still evaluating some of your competitors. The product's not baked into their workflow yet. If you don't have a trial or freemium offer, it could be they're in a demo or they just recently bought. Just because a company bought your product, purchased it, doesn't mean that every user is going to adopt your product and advocate internally for renewing. So don't discount this segment if you don't have a free trial or freemium offer. Beginners have started to adopt your product. They understand how it meets their basic needs, etc. Regulars, these are people like you're walking to the coffee shop and they already know your order. Like you're logging in regularly. Your workflow is very clear. And then champions, these are people who are proactively advocating for your product, participating in product development, etc. So I think this is a good framework to think about the different stages your users are at and how you want to treat them both as an active customer as well as a customer who's already churned. When I get into my tactics, no, that's fine. When I get into my tactics, I'm really going to be focused on kind of evaluators and beginners here. because I think there's something very interesting about the first phase of a user's life cycle that correlates with long-term retention that I really want to dive into because it's too often overlooked.
Mm-hmm. It feels really important right now as well, because during this tough time, there's some people who are getting signups through the roof depending on their product, right? But for those who aren't in that fortunate position, if you have got someone to that stage, right, you want them to convert as well and as highly as possible. Having broken down all these barriers and that tough market that we just articulated right at the start of this, it's making the most of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the greatest, there are lots of things you can do to keep your regular and champion customers engaged, right? But I think the greatest opportunity right now, thinking back to that HubSpot data and Telemized data, you see that there's more traffic to your website. You see that more people are, very, very early stages of evaluating products. So what if you could, but you're also seeing close rates and deal creation be down. So what if you could, convert, a few percentage more of those tire kickers into customers and get them to stick around for a long time. It'd be very, very meaningful for your business.
Yeah, and a question I have about this that maybe others have thought about as well is that we often think about these things in terms of funnels, right? And a flywheel here makes a lot of sense to me as to how we should think about this stuff, because it makes sense people flow around it as they progress. But do you often see different absolute numbers of customers in different stages? Like, does it look like a funnel in terms of the number of customers we should almost expect to be in any of these stages at any one time? It would be interesting to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, oftentimes, yes, especially if you have a trial or freemium model, you probably have a ton of evaluators at any given time, right? We've got thousands of trial signups every month. A minority of those turn into paying customers, or at least quickly. So for us, it largely does, but what you'll see in a lot of businesses is that the regular segment tends to be one of the largest. Okay. The reason why it's a flywheel is because I hope every marketer has realized this now, but word of mouth is more powerful than any marketing campaign you can send, right? So getting those people to advocate for your product, if they're not doing it proactively, you can ask, but that leaving reviews, recommending your product to friends, like, there is no better driver of acquisition. So if you can create a great product experience for your users, that is going to do wonders for top of funnel as well.
Brilliant, that makes sense. And that kind of leads us to our first poll. Like, having heard about the quadrant initially and the different types of ways you can approach and tackle churn, but also when the churn happens and how you should react to different customers differently based on where they actually got to in their own user journey. How are you guys thinking about segmenting your churn reduction strategies right now? And have you even done so? We'd love to get a gauge for the audience as to how they're thinking about this right now. And perhaps even more importantly, to augment that, I'm sure we'd love to hear from folks to share. We'd love to hear from folks and have them share when they have done this, what's really worked for them. Where did they start? What anecdotes can they share with the group that we could perhaps discuss here that others could take away and use as well? And again, just while some responses fly in there in terms of the poll and the comments, a question for you, Eric, just to buy the audience some time there. At what stage in company maturity do you normally see them start to actually segment some of this stuff up? Do they need an absolute number of customers in some of these sections of that flywheel? Or what stage do you normally see folks starting to think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's typically around the stage where you start to introduce like a formal customer success function or formal customer marketing function, product marketing. I don't think it's ever too early, right? Like, even if you only have 15 customers, you're already, actually, when you have 15 customers, you're already doing it, right? You're talking to them one-on-one. Maybe it's the founder, maybe it's, one of the leadership team, but you're probably talking to those customers one-on-one, and you're definitely treating somebody who just started using your product a week ago differently than somebody who's been using it for a year or went through some product development with you, right? So it's just this framework becomes a lot more practical as you start to scale things up and formalize your customer marketing and CS strategies.
Yeah, makes sense. And Bianca, do you want to share poll results or any comments that have come through in light of this?
Yep, sharing poll results now.
What's your take on that, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by the results, right? Like, we are just thinking about what we're doing. Certainly, as we think about our annual enterprise customers versus our SMB customers on monthly subscriptions. Certainly thinking about tactically, how do we keep them engaged? How do we add value? How do we keep them retained differently? And life cycle or age, these, I think it's a newer concept, so I'm not surprised to see it on the lower end. I am a little surprised to see that so many people are not doing any segmentation, but that's what we're talking about today, so hopefully it helps.
Yeah, it feels like an evolution as well, right? Like you start with the basic things like age and industry, and then evolve into life cycle. It makes a lot of sense. And industry and size make a lot of sense right now in the COVID world, where there's always this ROI figure, right? It's just like, how much can I invest in folks, and can I effectively and affordably look after these folks and give them one-on-one attention? And then equally, it feels to me it's no wonder that industries may be front of mind for folks right now, given some industries are more affected than others, and thus maybe more likely to churn depending on the nature of your product, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if our customer, if we're thinking about like, if Zoom was one of our customers, we'd probably be trying to upsell them right now. Whereas that's not a strategy we're implementing across the board. So
exactly.
It certainly helps.
I hope that they are a customer.
We have a question that says, what kind of pricing strategies can lower churn?
Yeah, pricing. I mean, so I think I was mentioning earlier, mostly in the context of new business, but certainly I think, any customer, we've had some customers reach out to us saying like, hey, going through hard financial times right now, is there anything we can do, or hey, we need to cancel, and we end up having a dialogue. We want to, we know that the software is important to our customers, and we want to, it's probably even more important now. So them being in a position where they can't pay, or they can't pay as much, is not a good situation for either of us to be in. So we've worked with some of those folks to think about short periods of reduced costs or deferred payments for a few months. So I think if showing empathy right now to your customer base is incredibly important, and it's going to build a lot of goodwill for long-term retention and happiness and advocacy as well. So be flexible. Don't when investors or your board is evaluating company performance this year, and you're looking a lot more at retention than they are at growth. Growth expectations can be very low. So just keep that in mind as you're maintaining these customer relationships.
Yeah, I can't echo that enough. I think how you behave is so important as a business right now, both to your board, to your investors, to your customers, and that will be remembered, and that will really impact you when we come through this, and we will at some point. And then just to add some, I can't echo what Eric said enough, but to add some more kind of views behind that, I'm not sure your pricing, as in how you actually price your products, is necessarily a tactic related to churn. Like your pricing should equate to the value folks are getting out of your product, I guess, and maybe they're seeing less value out of it in this environment. It really is going to depend on what you're doing. But I think Eric's point is you shouldn't necessarily adjust your price, your headline price that's on your page during this environment, but instead you should be showing empathy to customers, knowing that the cash flow is often the issue, which we talked about right at the start. And it's the deferral of payments, the more flexible payment terms, maybe the monthly plan rather than the annual, which is really going to build you that goodwill and ultimately have you net out at the same revenue as you otherwise would, albeit in a way that's much more feasible and appropriate for the customers in this time, if that makes sense. Anything else, Bianca, before we dig into some more strategies on this from Eric?
No, that's it.
Cool.
All right, great. So, I know we talked about the whole life cycle, and there's something to be said about every segment of customers, at every stage of their journey. But what I wanted to highlight today, it's a little self-serving to Appcues, sure, but this is something that we think about, in our own company strategy quite a bit. So if anybody's not familiar with this pirate metrics framework, it's basically this the 5 different metrics that you want to be looking at as a SaaS business, and they're called pirate metrics because the acronym is AARRR, so much like a pirate might say. And
I thought you were going to do the impression then, Eric. I was very excited.
I did last time I talked about this, but yeah. All right, maybe in a few minutes I'll work up to it. So we're looking at acquisition, activation, revenue, retention, and referral. And when you think about revenue, it's often thought of as like your price point, your ASP. Activation is the one that's typically the most misunderstood or you know, not talked about as much. But it is, you know, the simplest way to think about it, the moment one of your users sees the value of your product. Okay, so for us at Appcues, it is the first time that a user builds content, builds a flow. And so the more people we can get to that, you know, the number of people who start a trial and the number of people who do that, that's how we calculate our activation rate. And so we built this calculator and we went through this experiment of increasing every one of these metrics by 25% and seeing what the ultimate impact was on MRR. And by far, increasing activation by 25% had the most significant impact on MRR, even more than increasing retention by 25%. And so, you know, that's where I want to focus. So on the next slide, we talk about 1 week retention and how that impacts retention throughout a customer's life cycle. So this only goes through week 10, but the trend remains the same. In the first week, most products see that, you know, over 50% of the users go inactive at week 1. And so if you can move the needle there, if you can get more of those first week customers to stick around, from then on out, you're going to see higher retention rates across the board throughout user life cycles. And so, you know, when you go about identifying your activation, you know, figure out what that moment is where when people are saying, oh, okay, I get it. Like, this is how this product's going to help me. Right? It's different for every product, so I can't come out here and just prescribe what your activation moment should be. But if you can figure that out and then design that first, you know, day or that first week experience at driving people to that moment, this is actually, you know, I would go as far as to say it is the greatest lever you have for retention. And, you know, it's not saving customers who have been using your product for 2 years, but it is making the most of all that traffic, all those tire kickers, as I've mentioned, the lower conversion rates. Moving the needle there is your greatest lever. And then there's a little more data about this from Profitwell, one of the companies we cited earlier, which is great onboarding, which is, again, that first day or first week of experience with your product boosts overall retention. And so this said, you know, survey of I don't know how many people, but typically their surveys have very large, again, almost 10,000 subscription consumers. So the first, Profitwell had them rate, each of the subscribers rate their onboarding experience as either positive or negative, and then used those sentiments and correlated them with retention over, in this chart, over the course of 9 weeks. And you see across the board, anybody who said they had a positive onboarding experience at 3 weeks, at 6 weeks, at 9 weeks had higher retention rates. So again, just to kind of reinforce the data I just showed about that 1 week retention, it's a huge lever for long-term retention. And so I wanted to get that out front. If anybody has any experience with this or questions about this, feel free to chat them in. I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, and while some of those comments come in, I think activation and time to value is often thought of as this thing that's like short term in the earlier stage of that customer life cycle, right? And people neglect to think about what impact that's going to have for the long term for people, which this data is telling us about, right?
Yeah, it is not just about acquiring new customers. It's certainly not.
Any comments or feedback coming through on this, Bianca?
Evan mentioned on the chat that most churn for him is coming from happy customers who are short on cash. So their solution is to temporarily reduce rates or give 2 months for free.
Yeah, I mean, if cash is really the constraint, then absolutely. I think we've seen some folks write in and say, you know, for the value, I can't afford this right now, so we've offered, you know, free features or upgrades at the same price. But yeah, I think it's, like I said before, it's largely going to come down to payment terms and discounts.
Move on, Eric.
Cool. So I'm just going to show, because this first week period is not top of mind for everybody, I just want to show people a few examples of companies that have done this well, and give some principles and goals for how you do it. Now, to be clear, onboarding, you know, there are third-party vendors that offer this stuff, Appcues being one of them. There are many, but you should also be thinking about this in just your product design. And And it doesn't have to just be product experience. It can also be, you know, one of the things that we're talking about right now is we have a lot of self-service customers that come online and purchase themselves, and they don't get the hand-holding that you know, CS managed account does. And so right now we're thinking, hey, why don't we just make it, we'll crowdsource it, we'll have everybody in the company get involved, get on the phone with every single one of these self-service customers, spend an hour with them. You know, is it going to be profitable for us? Probably not, but that's really not the point right now, right? So this doesn't have to just be about in-product onboarding. The principles and the goals remain. I just want to put that up front. And when I talk about principles, like, it's about reducing friction. This is about getting to value very fast, making it as self-service as possible if you can. If you can't, like I said, there are lots of manual human touch points, ways that you can do this, and make it as personal as possible. So anytime you're on the phone with somebody, it's gonna be very personal, but in the product, take any opportunity you can to kind of base their experience on the behaviors that they've exhibited, or at a minimum, you know, use their name, use their company logo, and how you communicate to them. The goals here is you just want to motivate users to reach their goals, and typically their goal should be aligned with what your activation moment is. Educate users about how you solve their problems. So a lot of these folks in their first day, they're still trying to evaluate, right? We're seeing more and more people today just kind of skip the sales process, skip reading thoroughly all the marketing materials, and just go into the product and try to figure it out themselves. So education is important. And then guiding them to take meaningful action, right? Like getting them to the point where they're seeing meaningful action being the activation moment. So if you can actually design the product experience, design your communications to get them to that moment, that's what you're trying to do here.
This just a question from me, Eric, on that stuff. That is amazing stuff and really interesting. I think obviously the goal is to move them through that onboarding process and eventually move them through the flywheel, right? I guess a question I have in light of the kind of COVID world is, one, do people actually not only look at the number of customers they're able to move around that flywheel to eventually become champions, but also at this time, should we be looking at the time spent in any one of those categories? Because if there's a lot of web traffic and a lot of people kicking the tires, we worried there's a lot of people in this evaluation phase that are eventually going to drop out. How do we account for that?
Yeah, you know, things are changing so quickly. I think, like, in the COVID world, how do we think about conversion to this flywheel, how much time they should be spending? You know, I honestly haven't put a ton of thought into that. What you will see is a larger evaluator segment, and probably fewer people moving into the beginner stage. But you know, time spent, you know, when we talk about time to value, you want to get people out of the evaluation phase as fast as possible, but do so in a thoughtful way, right? And using these principles and goals, that's how you're going to go about doing that.
Makes sense.
So, you know, just a few examples here, because I think, you know, nothing like examples to help people you know, really grasp something. So I pulled up a couple examples from MailChimp and Quora here, and what they do is they're actually employing progress bars. So, you know, the MailChimp example is they're on the second step out of 6. The Quora example gives them kind of a percentage completion bar. But these do a lot for motivation, right? As you see that you're making progress through the initial stages of the product, or getting to that moment where you're seeing real value, visualizing that progress does a lot psychologically for your users. So, you know, just a really quick takeaway is, if you have the ability to add in some kind of visual representation of a user's progress as they enter your product and start to make progress toward that activation moment, or you know, setting up their account, etc., any way that you can introduce visualization of that progress will be a lever for you right now.
Makes sense. And as we run through these, it'd be great to hear about people's experience with this stuff, or whether they've got any ideas on these things. And we'll touch on those just at the end when Eric concludes. Yeah, and I could go a lot deeper on this stuff. I don't want this to be as much me talking at the audience. I want to do more questions, but so I'm just going to skim through these. The next example, you know, we're talking about you know, product tours, right? So product tours, when a user gets into your application, I think one takeaway here is, do not try to show them every bell and whistle of your product. Do not try to give them a tour of every feature of your product. Keep in mind that activation moment, and design a motivational, educational experience that is focused on getting them to that moment. Once you get them to
and start realizing the product can solve their problem, then it's time to start exposing them to more features. This is an example from Grammarly, which is, I don't know how the best way to pitch their product, but they basically help you with content creation. And when you get into their product, they have an example of something written already, so that you're not required to put your own content in there. That gives you an example right off the bat that you can interact with, how the product works and what it can do for you. So any opportunity you have to introduce kind of learn by doing type scenario is a big lever as well. And then my last example is from Basecamp. So they know core value of their product is evident only after the user adds other people from their team. So they're doing everything in their onboarding experience to try to get their new users to invite others. That is when the product becomes valuable, and so that is what they focus that initial experience on. So three really quick examples here, but the point is, focus on what that moment is where you show value, figure out what that is, and then everything in that first initial experience that a new user has should be focused on driving them to that moment. And if you do that, you will see increased retention across your customer base, and you will be able to take advantage, much better position to take advantage of that increased kind of evaluation traffic that a lot of companies are seeing right now.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Bianca, are there any questions about how someone might drive a customer through to that moment, or about these onboarding experiences from the audience?
Yes, so we have a question from Sophie, and it says, when you have a product that may have several activation moments for each customer, how do you determine the most important, or should you aim to reach all?
Yeah, if it is really that different, so if there's not one moment that applies to 75% or the vast majority of your users, then I think it's perfectly okay to ask up front. If your activation moments differ by the person's role, ask them what role they're in, and then put them into a different experience based on that role. If it differs by, or maybe there isn't a rhyme or reason, maybe there are just different things that people want to do and there's no common traits of those folks, you can just ask them up front. One of the things we've played with in the past is just saying, like, what did you come here to do? And we give them like 4 options, and then based on that option, we put them through a tour that's aimed at helping them accomplish that thing. So it's okay to ask that, and that's why, like, in the principles slide, I said, low or no friction most of the time. But sometimes it is okay to add a little friction in order to create ultimately a less an experience that has less friction overall.
Makes sense. Let's hope those conversion rates are high, and we don't have to add an option as to escaping the family or something as to what they're doing, as in kicking their tires during COVID and just trying to find something to do.
Yeah.
Any other comments, Bianca, from the audience?
That's it. We have plenty more in the Q&A section at the end.
Brilliant. So we've heard from Eric there on a bunch of ways to tackle that active churn and what we can do about it. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the involuntary churn and what we can do there and how we can avoid it before going through a lot of those questions you submitted up front. Similarly here, we're going to run through a short amount of content, answer questions as we go through, and then really start to dive deep in all of those questions you answered, which we're looking forward to digging into. And I'm going to be talking about a topic which I think should be more prevalent and higher up the discussion list, I guess, with regards to retention, and that's about payment acceptance. But let's just take a step back and talk a little bit about what payment acceptance is and why it should be a focus right now in this COVID world, and kind of what we can do to improve it. So typically, just to set the scene here, you can expect 20 to 40% of your churn to be from involuntary, this kind of delinquent passive churn we talked about, particularly if you take payments through cards. These are customers that are basically, we've been simply unable to charge successfully. They've been voluntarily churned because we haven't been able to charge them as a customer. Now, payment acceptance is a measure of our ability to charge these customers. And optimizing for payment acceptance reduces this involuntary churn figure in front of you. I always find it horrible to stick this number up in front of everyone. Like, I just find it horrible to consider that 40% of our customers that we're losing are completely passive. and not calling us or not hitting that cancel button, that they're just falling out of our list of customers involuntarily. But fortunately, there's a bunch of practical stuff we can do there to resolve that. So payment acceptance tries to focus on stopping payments failing in the first place, preventing the involuntary churn from happening. Now, there's an absolute ton of content out there in the market, and most SaaS companies certainly think about and aware of and focus on dunning, this kind of payment recovery piece, solving this kind of mess after it's happened. But the problem of payment acceptance, our ability to charge these customers in the first place, is much more impactful. It avoids the customer falling into this churn state in the first place if successful, and there's much more kind of dollars at stake, if that makes sense. And again, for those who are unfamiliar with it, payment acceptance is the measure of the number of successful charges you make over the number of attempts. This is something to be measured on your initial transactions, initial enrollment, as well as the recurring ones. You should even split this by geography. We could go really deep here, and I'd love to do so with some of the folks in attendance after this in individual sessions or whatever works for you guys. But this is a kind of 101 on what payment acceptance is. Now, before I talk about the impact it's having on your attention and why you should be thinking about this right now in this kind of COVID world and what we can do to improve it really tactically, I'm really interested to know how many folks know what their payment acceptance rate is. How many folks have looked at this? Don't be shy, be honest. Generally chatting about this as a topic to a number of different SaaS companies, it's quite rare that this is a metric they've been tracking until they realize the impact it's having on their performance. So please do respond to that poll there, and we'll get a lay of the land in terms of what folks are thinking about. Whilst those answers come in, I'd be more than happy to help anyone calculate their payment acceptance rate just afterwards. This is super easy, whether using Stripe, Braintree, or whatever. We can probably send you through some notes on how to do that just afterwards. But yeah, let us know how the panel, the audience have responded, Bianca.
Yes, we're just gonna wait a few more seconds.
2 seconds, yeah. Fortunately, this figure is quite easy to pull out of your current provider or your current setup just afterwards, and we've certainly got some content that we're sending out and a whole bunch of content on payment acceptance that we're delivering in the next couple of days that we can follow up with. Split the room, wow, that's amazing. Again, it'd be so interesting to hear what people's numbers look like right now, and whether that split is linked in any way towards the types of customers you're serving, whether that's B2C or B2B, because different companies targeting different types of users think about payment acceptance in very different ways. But fortunately, the ways in which we improve it are pretty consistent, depending on whether you're B2B or B2C or otherwise. And to run through those very briefly, and I hope there's some questions on this as we run through, and then we can tackle in the Q&A. There are 4 key ways to improve this payment acceptance figure. Firstly, look at the payment methods that you actually support and the ways in which customers are paying. So payment methods with a direct source of funds have better payment acceptance rates. Examples being digital wallets or direct debits or wire transfers. We see more than 2x the proportion of failed payments on card transactions compared with PayPal. On a B2B side, you might be thinking more about direct debits or wire transfers. They tend to be more popular on the B2B side. And again, are examples of payment methods with a direct source of funds. If you start taking payments via these methods, you are much less likely to have a high involuntary churn figure, because it's much easier for them to actually charge the customer. The next way that we can improve payment acceptance is through ensuring that we don't have expired cards on file and keeping those up to date. Encourage your customers to update their cards if that's how they've paid, and make it really easy and visible for them to do so in your account area or whatever it is that you've designed. If you have access to expiry data on the customer's card, get smart about asking them to update that when it expires or prior to trying to charge them. These days, many cards can actually be automatically updated through kind of connected bank networks when new cards are issued or even marked as stolen. And again, this is going to improve your attention and reduce that involuntary churn figure. Next, we got currencies. Like, I think I might start making t-shirts with this on, but like, just stop charging everyone in USD, people. Like, I cannot emphasize this enough. I talk about it all the time. If you've attended any other webinar with me before, you'll be sick of me talking about it. But when payments are in international markets, we typically see payments made in local currencies as 1 to 2% more likely to be successful, although in some regions up to 9%. And this is a win-win. Like if you price and showcase prices in local currencies, your acquisition is going to be better. You're going to convert more customers. They understand the pricing and it talks to them in a language they're used to. But also, and that's helping your acquisition. But when it comes to retention, and every single time you want to charge them in the future, again, your likelihood of success there is going to increase. So certainly think about currencies. And then lastly, routing payments through local acquirers. This is the most impactful thing that you can be doing. And something that I want you to all think very carefully about over the coming weeks. And this is exactly what our last slide is on here. So the biggest impact you can have on payment acceptance is the ability to route payments through local acquirers. And doing so requires you to set up local payment relationships in more specific regions to route transactions to, or something like Paddle can abstract the need for you to do this. But to give you an idea of the impact this has, which is phenomenal, and how it works, and what you're seeing in front of you is, when we A/B tested local acquiring in the United States at Paddle, and by that I mean running US transactions for US customers through banks and entities based in the US, tied to US entities, versus generic accounts in Europe or anywhere else in the world, we saw a 3% lift in payment acceptance on subscription renewals. This is huge. Like this translates directly into 3% less MRR churn across all of our sellers for their US-based customers. This compounds to over 30% less ARR churn within 12 months. Like these are big numbers, everyone. Today we've reduced ARR churn in markets that we're not optimized for by 30% in this example. And it's something I hope that we can discuss more shortly. But when you're thinking about churn during this really tough time, the real message I want to hit home is, for the customers who aren't actively trying to cancel or maybe don't have the cash flow issues, let's try and keep hold of those as best we possibly can and reduce that involuntary churn figure. And let's ensure that our infrastructure is actually set up in such a way that we're able to charge customers successfully, so that we're not losing them out the back door completely unnecessarily at a time when we're all scrambling for customers and revenue. Any questions on that before we dive into the summary and the longer Q&A, Bianca?
No questions on that.
Gotcha. Cool. So a quick summary of the content before we dive into that. And that's all from us slide-wise. Thank you so much for submitting comments and questions. We've learned a lot about how to do best-in-class onboarding, payment acceptance, the different ways you should think about churn in terms of the quadrant and your strategies there, as well as the life cycle. Any last thoughts from you, Eric, before we start diving into some of the questions?
No, let's dive right in.
Cool. Bianca, over to you.
Great. We have a question from Michelle. She's over in Sydney. She wasn't able to join because of the time zone, but I'm sure she'll be pleased at us answering her question. She asks, which practices would you prioritize for a company that has not experienced churn, that already has a firm customer base and is instead introducing SaaS and launching new SaaS product lines in the current market conditions?
Do you want to kick off, Eric?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the way that I hear that question is like, what do we do about, so for a company that's not going through what most companies are right now, and we're trying to launch new products, how do we kind of adjust the way we launch a product based on what's happening right now? I think keep in mind that unlike your company, Sydney, most companies are experiencing challenges right now with having fewer resources, having less cash, dealing with their own churn. So anything that you can do to kind of massage the messaging a bit to appeal to those challenges a bit more, I think would be best. I don't think, we've talked about this internally because we got some products we want to launch too. I don't think it's a bad time to launch a product. I just think it's important to do it with all of that in mind and make sure that as you position your product, you're positioning in a way that's very much in the context of what most companies are going through right now. If the real value to add can address their challenges, then people will buy new software.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And the only other thing I think that it may be worth adding is, whilst this isn't a problem now, or isn't a problem today, like make sure you're preempting that churn and designing your onboarding experience or setting up your billing infrastructure in a way that is going to reduce churn for the long term. Like don't get yourself in a position where you realize your time to value is poor and thus you're going to lose a bunch of customers out the back door. Or don't just realize that, oh, wow, actually we started to have this churn problems, and it turns out 40% of that is due to poor billing infrastructure because those customers are already gone at that point. Like, don't take for granted the fact that you've got customers right now that are happy and able to pay. And actually, what a great time to, when there's less pressure on you probably for growth, to actually set yourself up for the very best setup and infrastructure to ensure that you're not going to lose customers unnecessarily in the future would be what I'd suggest you consider here.
Yeah, you're in the best position out of most people here to actually put that 1 week, that first week experience into full focus right now, right? If you're still doing a little bit of product development, putting the finishing touches on it, make sure that initial experience is as best it can be. That's the most important part of that experience.
Yeah, and finally, I don't know the nature of the products you're rolling out, but perhaps this is targeted at a different persona, perhaps it's at a different price point, perhaps it's a different market entirely. And again, let's not assume that the previous performance area is going to manifest itself in the same way. And as Eric says, let's make sure we're set up for success here and make the product a successful launch, one without churning customers out the back door nice and early.
Great, thanks for that. We have a question from Vol. She asks, what are the best ways to show the value of the products in times of lockdowns?
Yeah, so I think, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'd come back to the messaging or choosing which features to highlight. People are having problems with doing more with less. Everybody's remote, so thinking about if one thing I haven't talked about is if there's anything that your product does to help with collaboration or working remotely or just being productive as a team when everybody's in different places, those are the types of things to highlight right now.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, yeah, to Eric's point, this isn't, we're in new circumstances, but your approach to how you showcase value to customers shouldn't change. Like what you showcase should change, but how you approach this problem probably shouldn't. And I think the great thing to do as a customer success leader would be try to align your product to the goals of the company right now. So understand those in the first place, understand how they're dealing with something like COVID or what it is they're trying to achieve as a business, and talk about how you can facilitate that. And to talk about Paddle here, or use that example, given that we think about how we message and position as a company, a lot of the time or to talk about our own evolution here, we've talked about how we as a product can help you acquire more customers. I mean, you can acquire more customers by moving into new markets. We can help you move upstream. We can help you sell internationally for the first time. We can help you move down market, perhaps. There's loads of different things that we've talked about in the past. But we recognize that this probably isn't the time that most folks are going to be doing that. And what are they trying to do? Okay, they're trying to cling on to as many customers as they possibly can. So how do we talk about all the different ways in which we can assist them in doing that? Again, it's exactly what Eric said. It's like pointing out the features of your product which are going to resonate the most right now. But this shouldn't be exclusive to COVID. It's just what features you point out probably will be, if that's fair, Eric, not to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Great. Next question is, what is the big win you see in every company to reduce churn right now?
I don't know that there's a silver bullet. I think the most important thing is something I mentioned probably midway through, which is just having empathy for your customers and being flexible with payment terms and being sensitive to their cash flow. I think that is the number one thing. If people will remember if you are empathetic.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we just given we're so obsessed with involuntary churn at the moment at Paddle, I think that the thing to remember when trying to think about business survival or what you should prioritize during this time is that, remember, a 1% reduction in your dollar churn equates to 14% month-on-month increases in acquisition, right? And one of those numbers, at least sentimentally to me, feels a lot more achievable than the other. When we're struggling to what to prioritize or what to do, let's rally around the things that are actually achievable and not set ourselves unrealistic targets during to quote unquote unprecedented times, right? And I really think, based on some of the advice that Eric's given or some of the stuff we've talked about today, that as a goal is achievable. for every SaaS company, and it genuinely is going to have an impact on your revenue. And I think to think about it in terms of the quadrants to spot where maybe you're missing resource or attention. Like think about your cancellation offers, your dunning, your retrial logic. Have you engaged the customer success team? Per Eric's suggestion earlier, are they on the phones with these self-serve customers? Are they keeping them active and happy? Or are you thinking about payment acceptance? Look at the quadrant, look at where your gaps are, and then see what you can do and see what you can action.
Yeah, and another thing that I've seen work pretty well for a few companies is if you've got a sales team that's really good, but demand is down, shift some of those people over into customer facing roles for a few months, right? Like put them on the CS team, do intro calls with every one of your self-service customers. It's all about that experience and building those personal connections right now. So you can think about how you reallocate resources temporarily to help with what's important right now.
Completely agree. It's going to build their empathy as well, right? And make them a better salesperson in the future, for sure.
Absolutely.
We have a related question from Scott. It says, with potentially thinner capacity due to layoffs or furlough, what are your recommendations for strategically identifying opportunities and deploying resources?
So I'd repeat what I just said. Layoffs have already happened, fine. But when you're thinking about where you can deploy resources, it's going to be into, well, for a lot of companies, into customer facing roles. So, if you've got folks who typically focus on paid advertising, I think we're seeing that overall traffic and interest is up, content consumption is way up, but response to SDR emails, responses to advertising, that's down, right? So hard selling is not working right now. So, think about how you can shift, somebody who might have been focused on paid advertising into, content creation, or maybe more of the advertising focuses on distributing that content. Think about how you might take a salesperson and put them in a customer facing role. But I think, the more customer communication and the more value you can add to not only your customers and your prospects through high quality content, that's what I'm thinking about every day. Our marketing strategy shifted to, we've always been super content heavy, but it's all content right now. And on the customer side, like I said earlier, we're talking about this. We haven't started doing it yet actively, but talking to every new customer, whether they pay us a couple $100 a month or thousands of dollars a month. We have to show a level of commitment to every single customer right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Hearing about all the suggestions that Eric's made there, or even all the things that you're thinking about at Appcues, I think the only other thing maybe worth touching on, which really becomes clear, is that there's a lot of stuff you can do. And ultimately, when thinking about resources and where you put them, you're going to have to be nimble and you're going to have to be agile. And when you're on the phone to those customers, you're going to have to hear what's resonating, what's not. You're going to have to look at what's working and what's not. And ultimately, it's the companies that are the most adaptable to the needs of right now for you as your business, which are going to come through this the best, because we have to understand that things are going to have to evolve during this period, whether that's messaging, whether that's where we invest our time and resources. And it's the folks that accept that and actually execute upon that change most effectively, which are probably going to come out of this the best. It's very high level, but that's what it feels like.
Megan asks, when customers are strapped for cash during this time, how do we best manage our cash collection process? We've given price discounts already. Do you have strategies for then collecting on those reduced invoices?
Harrison, you're probably in a better spot to answer this one intelligently.
Yeah. No pressure.
No pressure.
We've talked a little bit about pricing and discounts and cash collection today, and I think that the resounding points have repeated around be flexible with payment terms and show empathy to your customer. But I think that the way to then execute upon this effectively, I thought about this coming into the call today or the webinar today, was I think it's really important when offering that customer, particularly if you're in this B2B space where you maybe have this one-to-one relationship with the customer and it's high value stuff, is going into that discount or going into those adjusted payment terms. It should be very clear to the customer what the expectations are. and why this is happening. And if this shouldn't be coming as a surprise to them, they should be planning it. They should know that they're getting their 2-month trial period and then things are going to return to normal, or you're going to ramp up pricing or whatever it may be. I think that there's a point that understand before offering the discount why the customer needs it. Is it they've got less members in their team, they can't use the product anymore? Is it they're strapped for cash? Basically understand why it is they need this discount at this time. Give them an option that's appropriate, whether that's deferred payment, free trial, a pause subscription even. We've seen the number of pauses happening on the Paddle platform increase a huge amount during this time. But understand what it is they're trying to do and why. Offer them an appropriate option, and it should make the recovery and the return to normal of that a lot easier. To put this in a practical example, we power the sales of a ton of SaaS design products out there. And a number of design teams have been what we call furloughed in the UK, which means that they've almost put on temporary leave. And it means that no one's using the design tool. So it is completely appropriate for that customer to have that paused, and for an account manager to check in with someone and ask them when they're returning to work at some cadence, and then unpause the subscription when they can use it again, or adjust the seats based on the number of people who are actively working. I think if you show that empathy and you really deeply invest in the understanding of what it is the customer's trying to achieve, it probably is easier to come out of this on the other side too, because you've gone on that journey with them. For the folks who are dealing with lower value products where maybe you don't have that one-to-one relationship, again, I think some of the points around it being clear as to what they're being offered are really important, whether that's a cancellation offer or whatever. Are they getting 2 months? What happens after the 2 months? Are they automatically charged? Make sure that experience is good. And then make sure you've got the infrastructure set up in such a way that they're going to be able to be charged successfully, which we touched on a little bit. I don't know if there's anything you want to add there, Eric.
I would just say, like, from a human angle, just thinking about if I give a customer, if I work with them to create discounts for the next 3 months, or give them some kind of different payment terms. If we have a human conversation, we come to that agreement, and then I'm having trouble collecting those payments, I'm just going to go back to that person I had the conversation with and be like, hey, really happy to have worked through these flexible payment terms with you, but it's, we're all in this together. Like, we're going through, a tougher time too. So it's really important that we still collect that on time. So I just ask you in return, could you go to your, accounting person and just make sure that this gets paid? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's just a very human way to look at it.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So we have a question from Riley, and he says, how do you measure retention in a transactional business? Yeah.
Do you want me to kick off this one, Eric? Yeah, thanks for the question, Riley. We have this need at Paddle. We take a transaction fee as our revenue line, basically. We take a percentage of the gross sale amount. So I can just talk a little bit about what we do at Paddle. I'm going to keep things a little bit simple, but and talk maybe what I find most helpful to look at as one of the founders of the business. If you're needing to measure retention for a transactional business or something usage-based, or basically something that's volume-based and variable, I'd suggest that you think about user churn, certainly, a lot. Dollar churn becomes difficult because the seasonality, there's variability of the volume, and how usage increases, you've got transactions, so hopefully it aligns with revenue or something, but usage can vary over time, and that makes that more challenging. But I think that the first thing to do, and the basic 101 of churn to some extent, is ensure you're not losing customers, right? So look at user churn or account churn rather than dollar churn, just to keep things nice and simple. But I think what I'd advise you to do is, and what's been helpful for us, is separately look at expansion and contraction in the cohorts of customers you've acquired. So look at the customers you've acquired in Q1. What was their revenue in Q2? What were you able to get from them in Q3? Basically, are they growing? And look at that over time. You can then even draw aggregate trends, etc. So in looking at the cohorts of the customers you're signing up and how they're growing or shrinking over time should deliver you the outcome that I think you're looking for. And then looking at user churn gives you a good indication of, am I churning customers out the door? Why are they leaving? And you can approach those that have churned separately or however you want. But that's certainly, I think, it's not strictly how we do things at Paddle. It's a little bit more boring and detailed than that. But at the highest level as a founder, that's some of the things that I look at and think about.
Cool. We have one more question from Krishanu, and it says, what can we do for a B2C customer when the payment is one time? Should we slash prices or extend the validity of the service offered? Will that help us in converting the user?
I don't know exactly what type of business this is, but I'm imagining that, yeah, if it's an e-commerce model, you're selling a B2C product, maybe it's not software because it's one time. Offering some kind of discount right now can be helpful. Like I'm seeing most of the retailers, the online digital retailers that I frequent, offering some kind of discount across the board. But what I've seen, this maybe not quite as simple an answer, but something that's been really effective in my own personal experience is offering rare or limited time items right now can be really compelling for customers because they feel like it's something they can't typically get. So I'm going to make the purchase now. Combine that with some kind of discount, I think you're going to be in a good place. But without a little bit more detail about what the company is, it's and what your individual situation is, I'm not really sure how specific I can get.
Yeah, not knowing the product makes things really tough for sure. Just maybe to build upon some of the good advice there from Eric. I think also as a rule, let's not lose sight of not wanting to devalue or undervalue our products, and your price should always be based on value as well as willingness to pay. There's a ton of content out there on how to price intelligently, but do think about that and consider that when pricing your product, and price appropriately based on demand and ability to pay for sure, as well as value, which probably factors in some of the things you're considering. And then look at other levers to improve conversion, right? We've heard that currency on renewal, which isn't relevant to you, improves acceptance rates on renewal, but heck, supporting local currencies, supporting local languages is going to help you convert more customers. Supporting some of these payment methods we talked about today, again, is going to help you convert customers. I talked about how something like a digital wallet like PayPal, we 2x the number of failed payments on cards compared to PayPal. But another stat that we could throw at you in terms of acquisition for one time is that when I look at transactions below $50 in a country like Germany, 75% of those happen via PayPal. And if you're not accepting payment methods like that in regions that you're targeting, depending on your product, your demographic, I'm not sure if that's relevant, but basically there's an awful lot of levers you have available for you to pull beyond just pricing. And pricing is one to be careful with. It should evolve over time, but you really don't want to devalue or undervalue your product, and certainly consider things like currencies, payment methods, languages. And again, more than happy to do a deep dive with you on that, or have someone from the team to, if helpful.
Krishanu just told us that his business is in EdTech and that they sell courses to students for upskilling.
Interesting. We're seeing EdTech grow pretty significantly at Paddle. I don't have the data in front of me, but we segment up our user base by industry and what it is they're doing. A lot of them are in SaaS, not just one time. And there's definite growth there. So there is a real opportunity for you. I think to actually think a little bit about some of Eric's points earlier today, and I know they were framed in the context of SaaS, but rather than adjusting your pricing, because I assume that during this time you haven't decided that your value has decreased as a business or as a product. I also, these people may have a little bit less money available to them, so maybe that is something to consider. But perhaps the answer here is something like free trial, right? It's like, if we can reduce the time to value for these customers, they're more likely to pay. And maybe looking at usage patterns during that trial and how we can take someone down the right user journey to actually get them to learn with us, will increase your conversion rates. And that's your port of call, Eric, right?
Yeah. And my guess is that you probably have some data about students who buy and attend one course versus students who buy and attend 3 courses probably have much different lifetime values for your business. So maybe there's an opportunity here to bundle up some courses. So instead of offering just a discount on a single course, say your single course is the same price, but right now you can buy 3 courses for, ultimately it's going to be like 25% off, 33% off. So that way you've got, not only are you getting a purchase made, but you're also that person is committing to 3 courses, which internally is going to make them much more likely to continue being a customer of your education.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Awesome, thanks. He said that they're doing exactly that with free trial and bundling up.
Great.
We have one more question. I think, Eric, this would be great for you to answer. Denisha asks how to reprioritize customer marketing during this crisis.
So customer marketing, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different companies, but a couple of ways. I think, if you've offered flexible payment terms to a customer that is very happy, maybe ask them in exchange for a review on G2 or Capterra or something like that, or maybe in exchange for a case study, because it doesn't cost them anything and they're probably happy to do it if they're already a happy customer. That's something you could try. Another way is just as a customer marketer, you probably know the product pretty well and you know your customer base pretty well, so take some extra time, just call up a few customers a day and just spend a little time with them and ask them how they're doing. And then, one other thing you could do is, again, like we talked about earlier with highlighting specific features that may be particularly relevant or valuable right now. This is a good opportunity for you to highlight those features to your customer base.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have today. Thanks to Eric and Harrison for joining us today. Thanks to all the attendees. If you're still around, props to you. We're going to send the recording out as soon as we can, as soon as Zoom sends it to us. So again, thanks all for attending today and see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck with your attention. See ya.
Yeah.